Hello, and welcome to This Week in Sociological Perspective. I'm your host, Samuel Roundfield Lucas. This week, we discuss emerging controversy in how reporters cover wildfires. But first, I recently spoke with Geoffrey Wodtke, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Chicago, about his recent paper titled Toxic Neighborhoods: The Effects of Concentrated Poverty and Environmental Lead Contamination on Early Childhood Development. The paper is to be published in Demography and is co-authored by Sagi, Ramaj, and Schachner. Before I get to the interview, if you're watching this on YouTube, I have 3 brief requests to make and 1 offer to extend. My requests: if you find the show or episode interesting, please like, subscribe, and comment. My offer: if you want to receive no more than 1 email a week with a link to the new TWiSP episode, click the link in the description and then enter your email address. By doing this, you assure you will be notified no more than once a week about new TWiSP episodes. Thanks. I appreciate it. Professor Wodtke, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So your paper investigates the role of concentrated poverty on young children's cognitive achievement. So theoretically, why might concentrated poverty matter for children's academic or, young children's cognitive achievement?
Well, I think what kind of got me interested in the question and in general is that most of kind of existing theories or explanations for why concentrated poverty might matter for kids involved things that really only seemed relevant for older children or adolescents, like peer socialization, peer subcultures, adult role models, differences in school quality. That really it's difficult to imagine those things operating for very young children, infants and toddlers. But a lot of the socioeconomic disparities and academic achievement that, sociologists of inequality are interested in really kind of start to emerge and even become entrenched before school starts. So I was like, well, if neighborhoods are an important part of this process, something has to be going on in them for kids that are very young. And so one of those possibilities that sparked my interest and concern was differences in exposure to environmental health hazards, and in particular neurotoxic lead, which is a heavy metal that's dangerous for everyone, but especially for young children, even at very low doses.
Why is it, I can imagine that, young children are very vulnerable, but how is it that that's much more dangerous for young children?
So, at a basic level, young children are small. They breathe more air and drink more water per unit of body weight than adults. They also engage much more frequently in hand-to-mouth behavior, and they play on floors and rugs. Because of that, if they're living in an environment that's contaminated by lead from one source or another, they're more likely to ingest it, and then once ingested, it's also more easily absorbed by their bodies, and it's more likely to impact their central nervous system.
But how does concentrated poverty connect to the amount of lead in the neighborhood? How is that connection forged?
Yeah, so I sort of think of there as being kind of like macro level processes that lead to these kinds of environmental inequalities, and then kind of more specific ones with having to do with lead in particular. But I mean, some of the macro level processes involve like the siting of toxic infrastructure. So there's quite a lot of work on how, you know, noxious but maybe necessary infrastructure like highways, factories, other facilities that might emit all sorts of environmental health hazards, but also lead, are just more likely to be sited in near or upwind of poor neighborhoods because their residents tend to, have less time, resources, political clout to sort of mount effective opposition against the placement of that infrastructure. Differences in housing investment also play a role. So poorer neighborhoods tend to have older and also more dilapidated housing, which exposes their residents to, potentially harmful materials used in their construction. Disparate regulatory enforcement is another important factor. Is once neighborhoods become contaminated by health hazards, they need to be mitigated or abated, but that's costly. And landlords and other polluters in poor neighborhoods tend to suffer from tend to experience sort of weaker enforcement of environmental health protections. And then there's just the process of sort of residential sorting where people choose to live, right? If some neighborhoods become polluted or toxic, families with the means will pay to avoid them, which just kind of tightens the link between neighborhood composition and environmental health hazards. And kind of going from macro down to lead in particular, the main source of lead contamination in the US currently is lead-based paint, which was a popular wall covering in homes going back a long time, but in homes built before 1940, a very high proportion, like 80% or greater, have lead-based paint in them. Lead paint was banned in the late 1970s, but it's still in many of these homes, and older homes are more likely to be in poor neighborhoods, and also because these homes are not as well maintained in some cases. That paint is more likely to deteriorate, to flake, to chip, disintegrate into dust, where it contaminates homes and then kids play there. Lead plumbing is kind of an important secondary source. So lead was also banned for use in potable water systems in 1986, but it's still found in the water mains that connect homes to city service lines in lots of different places. And it's also found in older homes, again, in their interior plumbing, lead pipes and lead solder. And that's lead plumbing is more frequently found in older homes in poorer neighborhoods as well. And then kind of the third source is air pollution, and kind of by extension, soil contamination by lead. So when lead's emitted into the air by factories or coal-fired power plants or lead smelters, it goes up into the air, and it can be, inhaled by children, but it also settles to the ground, where it really just kind of remains indefinitely in the topsoil because it doesn't biodegrade. And so, kids, if they're playing outside, get it on their hands and then in their mouth, or they breathe in the dust, or parents, track it inside the home, on their shoes, where it sits on the floor, and they ingest it that way. And again, because, lead, industrial source lead emitters are more often located near poorer communities, they're disproportionately impacted. Even lead from, the era of leaded gasoline, cars that burned leaded gasoline pumped out enormous amounts of lead into the air, and this is no longer a problem today, but the lead that was emitted back then sits in the soil around, highly trafficked roads, freeways, which again tend to abut lower income communities. So that's kind of the macro, and then lead in particular.
Well, it's interesting how there are all these pathways, there are all these connections. So to investigate this, it seems very complicated. You analyze data from Chicago. Could you tell me, is this a study based on a representative sample of children, or could you tell me a little bit about the data that you use?
Sure. So our study uses data from a representative sample from a Chicago birth cohort. So this was children born in Chicago between 1994 and 1997. So we have a representative sample from that particular cohort of children, and then we follow those kids from birth through roughly the time of school entry, and we measure their vocabulary skills sort of at the very end of the survey, when they're getting close to starting school. And then we follow sort of the socioeconomic composition of their neighborhood from, very early in life up until the end of the study, as well as sort of measure the degree to which their neighborhood is contaminated by lead from different sources.
Did you take readings of their personal exposure to lead, or it was primarily the neighborhood?
Yeah,
opportunity to be exposed, I guess, for the neighborhood.
Yeah, so the city of Chicago has had a pretty impressive blood lead surveillance system in place since the mid 1990s, where nearly all children get a blood lead test that measures the amount of lead circulating in their blood. Most children, the testing is indicated at 12 months, 24 months, and 36 months. And most children will get at least one test during that period. And that's because, one, doctors are required to order those, but compliance is imperfect. But you need proof of a lead test in order to get your child into daycare or to enroll them in kindergarten in the city. So compliance is quite good. The city has compiled all of those blood lead test results for kids in the city going back to the start of the surveillance program in the mid 1990s. So in theory, we could match individuals in survey data in Chicago, right? The members of our sample in our birth cohort to their blood lead testing results in the surveillance system. But because, social science survey data is collected typically with, assurances about privacy, anonymity, right? We don't have the information that we would need to match individuals in our survey data to their blood lead testing results. So instead, even though a lot of our survey members are very likely represented in the blood lead surveillance data, so what we do is we compute like a local elevated blood lead incidence rate for all the neighborhoods in Chicago, which we use as like a proxy for the degree to which a neighborhood is contaminated by lead from all sources.
But that sounds like a really good measure, because what you're really trying to pick up is the precondition for people to have lead in their blood is exposure and probably for that age group in their neighborhood. And so what you're trying to do is pick up, did they actually get exposed? So if you're measuring the neighborhood at the level using the exposure of the children that you have, and connecting it to the neighborhood, that's actually a better measure than taking their own individual, because it's actually more reliable because it's based on more data. So it's a solid.
Yeah, I think that probably the jury is still out on whether like an aerial sort of proxy for individual exposures is better than the individual exposures themselves. But I mean, I have talked to environmental epidemiologists at the health department that would agree with that. Because I mean, there are issues with individual blood lead testing. It's a little bit of a noisy process, and so when you average over many kids in a neighborhood, you might actually be getting a more accurate picture of what's going on than looking at individual blood lead test results. Yeah.
So what is going on? What were your findings with respect to the role of neighborhood poverty and neighborhood lead exposure and its impact on children?
Yeah, so we found that growing up in a poor versus more advantaged neighborhood led to pretty steep declines in vocabulary skills measured later at around the time of school entry, and that a significant proportion of that effect could be explained by differences in exposure to lead contaminated environments from birth through school entry. So perhaps our estimates are a little imprecise, but based on our analysis, we can't rule out the possibility that all of the effect of growing up in a poor neighborhood during early childhood on vocabulary skills at school entry is due to differences in lead exposure. But because our estimates are imprecise, our results are also consistent, with only a sort of partial explanatory role for lead exposure.
When you talk about the partial exposures, the partial effect, would that be half of it, a quarter? Is there a sense of, even at the minimum, what it might be? Admittedly, this is groundbreaking research, so more has to follow. But the first read, is it when you think about how small might it be in terms of how little might be of the effect of growing up in concentrated poverty on vocabulary scores might actually just be connected directly through lead exposure?
Yeah, so we find, again, it's kind of a wide range because our estimates are imprecise, but we find that differences in lead exposure could explain all of the effects of growing up in a poor neighborhood, but it could also explain more like a third of that effect as well. So it's a wide range. I'd say what we've established is that differences in lead exposure, in Chicago, at the turn of the century, at least, played an important role in explaining the effects of, being born and spending the early years of your life in a poor neighborhood versus elsewhere.
Well, I'll admit, from 30%, 33% to 100% is a wide range. But 33 and 100% sounds, so large that it makes everything else seem small. But 33%, it's hard for me to think of things that we've established that you could explain 1/3 of the effect of poverty simply by addressing that issue. Now, maybe there are things like that, but usually these things are really like 5% here, 7% there. So that strikes me as a pretty large effect, even in the case of it being the smallest estimate that you came up with.
Yeah, I mean, I was also, just surprised by the sort of explanatory power, but I mean, I wouldn't say that, like we've explained the effect of poverty at large. Like what we're focused on explaining is sort of something a bit more specific, right? What we're looking at is what explains the effect of living in a poor versus a wealthier neighborhood, specifically during the first few years of life, right? From birth to about age 4, right? Lots of other things might happen after age 4, right? We're looking at one particular sort of developmental outcome, right? Vocabulary skills. There's lots of other things we might care about. So I think in terms of explaining, the effects of concentrated poverty on vocabulary skills during early life, lead seems to play a pretty important role. And I mean, I think that's because, lead for young kids is very harmful, and differences in lead exposure in Chicago, for the birth cohort that we're following, map very, very closely on to differences in neighborhood composition.
So what do your findings therefore mean for, there's this common finding, which you noted earlier, that children show up to school already behind. Children who are poor show up already behind. So admittedly, lots of things happen after they enter school. Life doesn't stop. It would be best if life isn't completely determined by age 6.
Yeah.
But addressing that, what would you say to a policymaker or politician or school superintendent or any actor in the city or in for any jurisdiction? What is a take-home message for them about things they could do or concerns to have as they try to maximize children and students' potential?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would first say that whatever you do, start thinking about that very early in these kids' lives, right? Like pretty much from the time they're born, or really even during gestation, lead can harm developing fetuses as well. So, rather than sort of thinking, what can schools do to help kids when, not that that's not important, and schools can do lots to help kids later on, but we really ought to start thinking, I think, about things, in addition to these later interventions that are more common, about, improving things very early during childhood. And to that end, into Chicago's credit, it's had quite a successful, lead mitigation and abatement program, and lead levels have declined a lot. They're in many communities that are disproportionately poor. There are still, elevated lead levels at a much higher frequency than anyone should be comfortable with. But overall, lead levels have come down, and socioeconomic disparities in those levels have also narrowed. And that's, partly due to, the city's efforts to, their blood lead surveillance system to identify where kids are in trouble. And then, there are other programs for mitigating lead, containing it, or abating it completely in homes. And, there's a program that's sort of just getting underway in Chicago to replace a lot of the lead plumbing and the lead service lines in the city. So we sort of, know what we need to do with lead in particular. And, many cities have been doing it. I think it's just maybe a matter of, increasing the urgency and the scope of those projects. And also recognizing that remediating lead is good because it improves population and child health overall, but it's also kind of indirectly anti-poverty policy.
Well, Professor Wodtke, I found this fascinating and a hopeful line of work, that there are things to do that can address some of the very stubborn inequalities we often see. So I appreciate your doing this work, and thank you for coming and sharing it with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Our final segment concerns emerging controversy in how reporters cover wildfires. An August 26th Christian Science Monitor article titled, "Where Should Reporters Draw the Line in Covering Wildfires?" began by telling the brief story of the behavior of an ABC News television crew a few days after the start of the McKinney Fire in Northern California's Klamath Forest. The news crew had brought a local resident, Sherry Marchetti Perot, to the site of the fire and followed her on camera as she searched for a missing uncle. The monitor went on to say, quote, "What happened next drew widespread condemnation. ABC national correspondent Matt Gutman reported from the site that Ms. Marchetti Perot had found the body of her uncle. Mr. Gutman identified the victim as John Cogan long before authorities officially did so." Unquote. Residents accused ABC of exploiting Ms. Marchetti Perot. Some journalists accused the news crew of creating their own news, and the sheriff announced a criminal investigation focused on possible charges of trespassing and tampering with the crime scene. The legal background of this debacle is that California law allows journalists to enter restricted burn zones before the general public. The Monitor report indicated that sometimes this access has led to conflict with local residents. This law, and the behavior of journalists in accord with this law in disasters like wildfires, raise many questions. One fundamental sociological question is, what is the role of a journalist in such a situation? We can draw a distinction between information someone might want to know on the one hand, and information someone might need to know on the other. But before using this distinction, we have to acknowledge the diversity of the someones who are the subject of the question. Disparate someones include those who live, work, or otherwise occupy areas threatened by the fire, and loved ones of the former. These are people closest to the event who perhaps have particular interests. For example, some of them may want to know whether their home at 444 Fee Avenue has burned yet. At some point, those who are directly connected to the event need to know such information. Other disparate someones include people in the general public. These people may have no knowledge of any addresses threatened by the unfolding disaster, but knowing some of the facts of the event might still be important to them. For example, knowledge of the event might lead people to act differently. Perhaps they take a look at their own fire insurance. Perhaps the next time they consider moving, they integrate knowledge of fire risk in their assessment. Now, we can ask, was Ms. Sherry Marchetti Perot's step-by-step search through the burned-out property a need-to-know matter for anyone other than her family, and friends? Was it a want-to-know matter, and if so, for whom? Or was it simply a fairly easy way for a news organization to handle the event? Sociologists such as Edward Epstein and Todd Gitlin long ago helped establish that news organizations frame any story they cover. Basically, one of the key things that a frame does is it subtly and not so subtly conveys for whom one should cheer and at whom one should boo. For example, every time the news anchor smilingly asserts that the news is, quote, good, house prices are up, they are deploying a frame that suggests we should cheer the homeowners who are amassing increasing wealth and completely ignore anyone trying to buy their first house. To take someone who is worried about a loved one into the burn zone to look for them is arguably one of the laziest ways to cover the event. It deploys a frame that has the audience hoping for a living reunion, with all the tension a real possibility of finding a dead body can offer. Is this the job of a journalist, or would this job be better left to trained search and rescue personnel and grief counselors? Further, does such coverage meet a need of the wider public? This incident is just the most extreme example of a largely uninformative pattern of news coverage. Every year there are wildfires across the West, and every year we see the same shots on video. Close-ups and medium shots of the fire burning, helicopters ferrying water to the blaze, and planes dropping fire retardant. You know what we rarely see? A shot tracing the perimeter of the fire, or a topological map of the fire, either with clearly marked boundaries, so we can grasp the full extent and challenge of the blaze. It's the same with almost all disasters. When covering a hurricane, news organizations often show National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's satellite images of the massive storm. This coverage suggests the journalists recognize there is informative value in a big picture perspective. But outside of hurricanes, they seem to forget that fact. Thus, be it earthquake, flood, tornado, or tsunami, the camera operator, guided by the inertial norms of video news, zooms in on a specific spot of damage, or shows a few people caught in the middle of the disaster. Rarely do they show the public the breadth of the earthquake footprint, flooded area, tsunami zone, or tornado path from start to end. The news is seemingly obsessed with covering the personal tragedy, and thereby misses the forest for the trees. Sociologists point to financial pressures, reduced budgets, norms and traditions of coverage, and more to explain what is and is not provided by the news services. But we can ask, what perspective is most helpful? An up-close and personal look at one person's experience, or a big picture look at the conditions affecting a large swath of the public? And we can ask, what kind of take does the public need at the time of the event? And what do they need sometime afterwards? The ABC News crew may not have asked any of these questions when they made their way into the burn zone, while firefighters were still battling the fire just a little ways away. But these are questions we can ask when disaster inevitably strikes again. And based on the answers we provide, we can make a conscious decision of whether or not to watch and listen when journalists insert a camera and microphone into the face of family tragedy as they turn away from informing the public about the breadth and reach of the blazing inferno itself. That's This Week in Sociological Perspective. We'll be back next week with another interview with an author of some important sociological research and more sociological insights on an issue in the news. Till then, take care.